The nights were always calm in the little suburban neighborhood, the kind where you could hear the distant hum of crickets and see the soft glow of porch lights lining the street. It was a peaceful area, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and kids played outside until the sun dipped below the horizon. But inside the Parker family home, something unsettling was happening, something no one could explain. Max, their loyal German shepherd, had always been the perfect family dog. He was gentle, protective, and loved by everyone, especially little Emma, the youngest member of the family. At only 5 years old, Emma adored Max. She would often be found curled up beside him, reading her picture books aloud or burying her tiny hands in his thick fur. Max seemed to love her just as much, his tail wagging furiously every time she called his name. But then, everything changed. It started as a faint growl one night. At first, it was so soft that John, Emma's father, thought he had imagined it. He was half asleep on the couch when he heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from the direction of Emma's room. Max was outside her door, his ears pinned back, and his body stiff. John chalked it up to nothing. Maybe Max had heard a noise from outside or was restless. But the growling didn't stop. Each night, as Emma slept peacefully in her room, Max would position himself just outside her door. The growls became louder, more insistent, and John couldn't ignore them anymore. He tried to reassure himself. Max was a dog, after all. Dogs sometimes did strange things. But there was something about the way Max stared at Emma's closed door, something almost unnatural. John mentioned it to his wife, Sarah, who dismissed his concerns at first. "He's probably just being protective," she said, brushing off his worries with a laugh. "You know how he is about Emma. He adores her." But John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Max's behavior grew stranger with each passing night. He wouldn't let anyone near Emma's room after dark, not even John or Sarah. When they tried to move him, he would plant himself firmly on the floor, growling louder, his eyes fixed on the door as if guarding it from some unseen threat. John's unease turned into frustration. Max had never acted like this before. He had always been a calm, well-behaved dog. What could possibly be making him act this way? Was there an animal outside the house that Max could sense? Or was it something else? One night, John decided he'd had enough. He was determined to get to the bottom of Max's behavior. As Emma slept soundly in her bed, her favorite stuffed bunny tucked under her arm, John set up a small camera in her room. If there was something unusual happening, he wanted to see it for himself. The next morning, as John reviewed the footage, his heart raced. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes narrowing as he replayed one specific moment over and over. His breath hitched, and a chill ran down his spine. Something was in the room. John couldn't believe what he was seeing. His stomach turned, and his mind raced with questions. What had Max been trying to warn them about? How had they missed the signs for so long? As he sat there, staring at the screen, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever was happening in Emma's room wasn't just strange. It was dangerous. What John discovered that day would change everything. It would shatter their sense of security and reveal a truth more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. And as he turned to look at Max, who sat quietly at his feet, John realized something else. The dog had been trying to protect them all along. John sat at the dining table, the early morning light filtering through the kitchen window. His coffee sat untouched in front of him, the steam curling up and disappearing into the stillness of the house. His mind raced as he replayed the footage again and again on his laptop. Each time, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He couldn't bring himself to believe what he was seeing, but the evidence was right there. Someone had been in Emma's room. The figure was faint, almost like a shadow, barely distinguishable from the darkness of the room. It had moved silently, just near the edge of her bed. The way it lingered, hesitating before retreating into the corner, sent chills through him. John felt his stomach twist as his protective instincts kicked into overdrive. He couldn't let this go on another night. Max sat at his usual spot near the door, his head resting on his paws. His eyes, however, remained fixed on John, as though waiting for him to act. The dog's behavior had always been uncanny, almost as if he understood what was happening better than anyone else. John glanced down at him and muttered, "You knew, didn't you? You've been trying to tell us." Sarah walked into the room, her robe wrapped tightly around her. She noticed John's pale face and the intensity in his eyes as he stared at the laptop. "What are you doing up so early?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. She glanced over his shoulder at the screen. "Is that the footage from Emma's room?" John hesitated. How could he explain what he'd seen without sounding crazy? He wasn't even sure he believed it himself. "Yeah," he said quietly. I think we need to talk." Sarah set her cup down and leaned over the table, her brow furrowed. "Talk about what? Did you see something?" John took a deep breath. "There's someone in the footage. Or something. I don't know how to describe it, but it's not right. It was standing near Emma's bed last night." Sarah froze, her face losing its color. "What are you talking about? You mean like an intruder?" "I don't know," John admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "But it wasn't just a trick of the light, Sarah. It moved. It was there. And Max has been trying to warn us." They both turned to look at Max, who let out a low whine, his ears perking up as if he understood every word they were saying. Sarah ran a hand through her hair, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. "Maybe we should call the police," she said. "If someone's been in the house." "No," John interrupted, shaking his head. "The doors were locked. The windows were locked. There's no sign of anyone breaking in. Whoever or whatever it is, it's not coming in from outside." Sarah's eyes widened, and she clasped her hands together tightly. "What are you saying? That it's in the house already?" John didn't respond. He didn't know how to. The idea was terrifying, but there was no denying what the footage showed. He reached out and placed his hand over Sarah's. "We need to stay calm. We'll figure this out. We'll keep Emma safe. I promise." That day, John couldn't focus on anything else. Every sound in the house made him jump. He checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The house felt the same as it always had, warm, familiar, and safe. Yet, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just out of sight. Emma, blissfully unaware of the tension in the house, spent the day playing with Max in the living room. Her laughter echoed through the halls, a sharp contrast to the fear gripping her parents. Max followed her every move, his body tense and his eyes scanning the room constantly. John noticed how the dog never left Emma's side, as if guarding her from some unseen danger. By the time night fell, John and Sarah were on edge. They had decided not to tell Emma anything for now. There was no need to frighten her until they had more answers. But as they tucked her into bed that evening, both parents exchanged a nervous glance. Max had already stationed himself outside Emma's door, his body rigid and alert. "Good night, sweetie," Sarah said softly, leaning down to kiss Emma's forehead. "We'll be right down the hall if you need us." Emma nodded sleepily, clutching her stuffed bunny. "Night, Mommy." "Night, Daddy." John lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. Everything looked normal. Her bookshelf, her nightlight casting soft shapes on the wall, the pile of toys in the corner. But the feeling of unease lingered. He closed the door gently, leaving it open just a crack. In their bedroom, John set up the laptop to monitor the live feed from Emma's room. The camera's faint green glow illuminated the dark screen as they both sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the footage in silence. Minutes turned into hours, and nothing happened. The only sounds were the soft hum of the baby monitor and the occasional rustle of sheets as Emma shifted in her sleep. Just as John began to think they might have overreacted, Max's growling broke the silence. It was low and guttural, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. John and Sarah froze, their eyes snapping to the screen. There it was again, that shadowy figure, barely visible but unmistakable. It hovered near Emma's bed, moving so subtly it was almost imperceptible. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as she stifled a gasp. "Oh my God, John," she whispered. "What is that?" Before John could respond, Max's growling intensified. The figure seemed to pause, as if noticing the dog's presence for the first time. Then, without warning, it vanished, fading into the darkness like smoke dispersing into the air. John leapt to his feet, his heart pounding. "Stay here," he ordered Sarah, grabbing a flashlight from the nightstand. "I'm going to check on her." He hurried down the hallway, his footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. Max was standing in front of Emma's door, his body tense and his teeth bared. The dog's growl didn't stop, even as John approached. John gently pushed the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Emma was still asleep, her small form peaceful and undisturbed. But something wasn't right. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating, and a faint, unfamiliar smell lingered, a mix of something metallic and damp. John scanned the room, his flashlight sweeping over every corner. Nothing. Max followed him inside, still growling softly. The dog's gaze was fixed on the same corner where the figure had disappeared on the footage. John knelt down beside him, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it, boy? What are you seeing?" Max didn't move. His body remained stiff, his growl unwavering. John's pulse quickened as he turned the flashlight toward the corner. It illuminated nothing but the pale pink walls and a stack of Emma's toys. Yet, John couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there just out of sight, watching them. John crouched in the dimly lit corner of Emma's room, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. The space appeared empty, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Max's growling persisted, unwavering and directed at the same spot. John reached out hesitantly, running his hand along the wall and into the shadows, expecting to feel something out of place. Nothing. Just the cool, smooth surface of the painted wall. Still, the air felt different here, denser, colder, as if it held on to something invisible yet palpable. He stood up slowly, his eyes darting around the room. Emma stirred slightly in her bed, clutching her stuffed bunny closer, but she didn't wake. John felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him, mingled with a deep unease. What was he dealing with? Could it be a trick of his mind? Was exhaustion amplifying his fears? But then there was Max. His unrelenting vigilance proved this wasn't just paranoia. Max knew something was wrong. He always had. Back in the hallway, Sarah was pacing nervously, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. When John returned, she rushed toward him, her voice low but urgent. "What's going on? Did you see anything? Is Emma okay?" "She's fine," John assured her, though his voice betrayed his own uncertainty. "But there's something in that room, Sarah. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal." Max knows it too. He hasn't left her side. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to do something. We can't just keep watching this happen night after night. What if it's dangerous? What if it tries to hurt her?" John nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but I don't even know where to start. The footage, Max's behavior, it's all pointing to something, but I can't make sense of it. And it's not like I can call the police and tell them there's a shadow in my daughter's room." They spent the next day poring over every detail they could think of. John replayed the footage again and again, scrutinizing every second for clues. Sarah scoured the internet, searching for anything that could explain what they were experiencing. Stories of hauntings, paranormal encounters, and unexplained phenomena filled her search results, but none of it brought them closer to an answer. By the afternoon, Sarah suggested something that made John hesitate. "What if we talk to someone who knows about this kind of thing? A professional, like a paranormal investigator?" John frowned, his skepticism evident. "You really think someone like that could help? Most of those people are just looking for attention. This is our daughter we're talking about. I don't want to bring in some stranger who might just make things worse." "I get it," Sarah said softly. "But what else are we supposed to do? We can't keep ignoring this, John. We need answers." Reluctantly, John agreed to give it a try. That evening, Sarah contacted a local investigator she'd found online. The woman, whose name was Lila, had a reputation for being thorough and discreet. When Sarah explained their situation, Lila didn't sound surprised. "You'd be amazed how many people call me with stories like yours," she said. "I'll come by tomorrow evening. Just try to stay calm until then." The next day dragged on. John and Sarah kept a close eye on Emma, who remained blissfully unaware of the tension swirling around her. Max, on the other hand, seemed even more vigilant than before. He rarely left Emma's side, his ears constantly perked up as if listening for something only he could hear. When Lila arrived, she was nothing like John had expected. She was calm, composed, and professional, with a notebook in one hand and a small bag of equipment in the other. She listened carefully as John and Sarah recounted everything. The growling, the shadowy figure, the strange sensations in Emma's room. "I believe you," Lila said simply when they finished. "And I think your dog does too. Animals are incredibly perceptive. They often notice things long before we do." John felt a small wave of relief. At least she wasn't dismissing them outright. But her next words sent a shiver down his spine. "The presence you're describing, it's not uncommon. But it's important to figure out what kind of energy we're dealing with. Not all of these encounters are malicious, but the fact that your dog is reacting so strongly suggests there's a protective instinct at play. He senses a threat." Lila set up her equipment in Emma's room. A combination of cameras, audio recorders, and devices that John didn't recognize. She asked the couple to leave her alone in the room for a while, promising to keep Emma safe and let them know if she found anything. John was reluctant, but he trusted Lila's calm demeanor and Max's unwavering presence. Hours passed as Lila worked, and when she finally emerged from the room, her expression was serious. "There's definitely activity in there," she said. "I can't explain it fully yet, but the energy is strong. It's tied to that corner of the room, the one Max keeps focusing on." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "It means there's a history here," Lila explained. "Something or someone left an imprint. It could be tied to the house, or it could be something that followed one of you here." John felt his stomach tighten. "Followed us? How?" "Sometimes objects, places, or even emotions can act as anchors," Lila said. "Have you brought anything new into the house recently? Something from an old home? An antique? Anything unusual?" John and Sarah exchanged a glance, their minds racing. They couldn't think of anything that fit the description. But Lila's words lingered in John's mind, planting seeds of doubt and fear. What if they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding? As the night wore on, Lila stayed with them, monitoring the equipment and offering reassurance. But the tension in the house remained thick, the unanswered questions hanging heavily in the air. John couldn't shake the feeling that whatever they were dealing with wasn't finished, that the worst was yet to come. That night, the house seemed to hold its breath. The usual creaks and groans of settling would sounded sharper, more deliberate, as though the walls themselves were aware of the tension within. John sat on the edge of the couch in the living room, his eyes locked on the laptop screen where the live feed from Emma's room played. Beside him, Sarah sat with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her face pale and drawn. Max lay at their feet, his ears twitching at every faint sound. Lila was still in Emma's room, quietly observing and recording. She had assured them that Emma was safe, but John couldn't shake the gnawing unease that had rooted itself deep in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to go back into the room, to pull Emma out and hold her close. But he knew they needed answers, and this was their best chance of getting them. The minutes ticked by, dragging into what felt like hours. Just as John began to think the night would pass uneventfully, Max's head shot up. The low, rumbling growl that had become so familiar started deep in his throat. John's stomach churned as he followed the dog's gaze to the screen. There it was again, the shadowy figure, barely discernible, but undeniably there. It moved slowly, deliberately, toward Emma's bed. "John!" Sarah's voice was a frantic whisper as she clutched his arm. "Do something." John didn't need to be told twice. He jumped up, grabbing the flashlight and rushing down the hallway with Sarah close behind. Max bolted ahead of them, his growling growing louder with each step. When they reached Emma's door, Lila was already there, her face pale but composed. She held up a hand to stop them. "Wait," she said firmly. "It's here. I can feel it." "What do you mean, feel it?" John demanded, his voice shaking. "Emma's in there. She's okay for now," Lila assured him, though her eyes betrayed her own fear. "But this presence, it's stronger than I expected. It's not just residual energy. It's active." Max barked sharply, his teeth bared as he stared at the door. John couldn't take it anymore. He pushed past Lila and threw the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Emma was still in her bed, sound asleep, but the air in the room was thick and suffocating. The corner that Max always fixated on seemed darker than usual. The shadows, they're impenetrable. "Emma!" Sarah rushed to her daughter's side, her hands trembling as she checked to make sure she was okay. Emma stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Lila stepped into the room, her voice calm but authoritative. "John, stay close. Whatever this is, it's reacting to us now. Don't provoke it." John's heart pounded as he stared at the corner. The shadows seemed to shift, almost as if they were alive. Max barked again, his body rigid and his hackles raised. For a moment, John thought he saw something, a faint outline, barely visible, like smoke taking shape. Lila pulled a small device from her bag, a handheld tool with blinking lights and a faint hum. She pointed it toward the corner, her expression grim. "It's concentrated here," she murmured. "The energy is intense." Suddenly, the room grew colder. The temperature dropped so quickly that John could see his breath in the dim light. Emma's nightlight flickered, casting eerie shapes on the walls. Sarah clutched Emma tightly, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" she whispered. Before anyone could answer, the figure became more distinct. It was no longer just a shadow. It had form now, vague but unmistakable. It loomed in the corner, taller than John had expected, its presence radiating a malevolent energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Max lunged forward, barking furiously, but something seemed to stop him. He froze mid-step, his growls turning to whines as he backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. John had never seen the dog so frightened, and the sight sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through him. "John, we need to leave this room," Lila said urgently. "Now!" "But Emma," Sarah started to protest. "She'll be okay for a few seconds," Lila interrupted. "But if we stay, we're only going to escalate things. Whatever this is, it's feeding off our fear." Reluctantly, they all backed out of the room. Max followed, still whining softly, his body trembling. Once they were in the hallway, Lila closed the door behind them and turned to face John and Sarah. "This isn't just an ordinary haunting," she said, her voice steady but grim. "This is something more powerful. It's been here for a long time, and it's not going to go quietly." John felt his knees weaken as the weight of her words sank in. "What are we supposed to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we get rid of it?" "I'll do everything I can," Lila said. "But you need to prepare yourselves. This might not be a quick fix. Whatever this is, it's tied to something or someone in this house. We need to find out what's keeping it here." Sarah clutched John's arm, her face pale and tear-streaked. "We can't let it hurt Emma," she said desperately. "We have to protect her." "We will," John promised, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. "We'll do whatever it takes." Lila nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we start digging. There's a story here, a reason why this presence is so strong. And we're going to find it." As they stood there in the dim hallway, the weight of the situation pressing down on them, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Whatever was in Emma's room was growing stronger, and he had no idea how much longer they could keep it at bay. The silence in the hallway was deafening, broken only by Max's soft whimpering and the faint hum of the devices Lila had left behind in Emma's room. John couldn't shake the sensation that something was still watching them, even with the door closed. Sarah held Emma tightly, whispering soothing words into her ear, even though the little girl remained blissfully asleep. The fragile sense of control they had clung to earlier in the evening was quickly unraveling, and John could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Lila's calm demeanor cracked just slightly as she glanced at the closed door, her lips pressed into a thin line. She seemed to be calculating something, weighing their next move carefully. "There's something I didn't want to say earlier," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now, I think you need to know." John tensed immediately. "What are you talking about? What haven't you told us?" Lila hesitated, her eyes flicking between the couple before settling on John. "When I first walked into this house, I felt it. A presence. Yes, but not just in Emma's room. It's in the house. Everywhere. It's as if it's tethered to the very foundation of this place." Sarah's grip on Emma tightened, her knuckles white. You're saying it's not just a room? That nowhere is safe. I'm saying the room is the focal point, Lila clarified. But whatever this is, it's bigger than that. And it's not random. Something or someone brought this here. John's mind raced. The idea that they had unknowingly invited something so dark into their home was horrifying. He thought back to the past few months, trying to pinpoint anything unusual, but nothing stood out. They were a normal family, living a normal life, weren't they? Could it be tied to the house itself? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We've only been here a year. What if it's something that happened before we moved in? Lila nodded. It's possible. In fact, it's likely. These kinds of presences often have deep roots tied to trauma or unfinished business. But we need to be certain. There's something else I want to check. Before John could ask what she meant, Lila turned and headed toward the small office at the back of the house. It was a space they rarely used, filled with unpacked boxes and random odds and ends. John followed her, confused, as she began searching through the clutter with purpose. What are you looking for? He asked, his frustration mounting. Records, Lila replied, her tone clipped. Anything left behind by the previous owners. Old deeds, letters, photos, sometimes these things hold clues. John felt a flash of anger. You're telling me we're dealing with some kind of ghost because someone left a box of papers in our house? How does that even make sense? It's not the objects themselves, Lila said patiently, though her eyes were sharp. It's the energy tied to them. The emotions, the memories. If someone experienced something traumatic here, that energy can linger, especially if it wasn't resolved. Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding Emma and looking on with equal parts fear and skepticism. And if we find something? What then? Then we understand what we're dealing with, Lila said simply. And we figure out how to make it let go. John was about to respond when Lila suddenly froze, her hand hovering over an old, dusty box. Her expression shifted, curiosity giving way to something darker. She pulled the box toward her, carefully opening it to reveal a collection of photographs, yellowed documents, and a small, intricately carved wooden box. The air around them seemed to grow heavier as she lifted the lid of the smaller box, revealing a bundle of what looked like old letters tied together with frayed string. What is it? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lila didn't answer right away. She untied the string and unfolded the first letter, her brow furrowing as she read. John leaned closer, his curiosity overcoming his apprehension. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the ink faded, but one word stood out immediately. Emma. John's blood ran cold. That can't be. It's not your Emma, Lila said quickly, though her tone wasn't entirely reassuring. But this is a connection. Whoever lived here before you had a child named Emma. And from what I'm reading, something happened to her. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. What are you saying? That this is about her? That this thing in our house is tied to some other Emma? It's more than a coincidence, Lila said carefully. And the fact that it's manifesting so strongly in your daughter's room suggests there's a direct link. Spirits are often drawn to familiar names, familiar energy. John felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. None of this made sense, but at the same time, it explained everything. The strange behavior, the shadow in Emma's room, Max's protectiveness. It wasn't random. It was personal. Keep reading, John urged, his voice thick with tension. What happened to her? Lila flipped through the letters quickly, her expression growing darker with each one. It's fragmented, she said, but there's a pattern here. This family, whoever they were, experienced something tragic. The child, Emma, died young. And her death, it wasn't natural. Sarah gasped, clutching Emma tighter as if to shield her from the weight of the words. John felt his anger flare. You're saying this thing in our house is tied to that? That it's here because of what happened to her? Lila nodded slowly. It's possible, but it's not her spirit, she added firmly. This isn't the energy of a child. Whatever this is, it's something darker, something that was drawn here because of her death. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in with an almost physical force. John felt the weight of the discovery settling on his shoulders, a heavy, suffocating presence that mirrored the darkness in Emma's room. They had uncovered a piece of the puzzle, but it was only the beginning. The truth was far more horrifying than they had imagined, and the danger felt closer than ever. John felt a strange mix of fear and determination as he stared at the pile of letters and photographs that Lila had carefully laid out on the table. The weight of the truth was heavy, but now they had something to hold on to, something tangible to confront. For the first time since the nightmare had started, they weren't just reacting. They were piecing together the story that had been haunting their home. Lila leaned over the documents, carefully piecing together the fragmented history of the previous family. The letters suggest that Emma, the little girl, had been sick for a long time, she explained. Her parents, especially her father, were desperate to find a cure. He turned to unconventional means. What does that mean? Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she held their Emma close. Lila hesitated, her eyes scanning the pages before she spoke. It seems he sought out someone, an old healer or medium, who promised to help. But the methods were dangerous. Rituals, sacrifices. He was warned there would be consequences if things weren't done exactly right. And judging by these letters, they weren't. John felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying this man brought something into this house? Something he couldn't control? That's exactly what I'm saying, Lila replied grimly. And whatever he summoned, it's still here. The room was silent except for the sound of Max's soft whining. Sarah looked at John, her face pale. What do we do now? She whispered. How do we stop it? Lila took a deep breath. We have to confront it. Spirits or entities like this thrive on fear and unresolved trauma. But they can also be released if we break their tether to this place. That means addressing the unfinished business, helping it let go. How? John asked, his frustration boiling over. It's not like we can sit it down and talk things out. We can't, Lila agreed. But we can use what we've learned. The father's actions brought it here, but his desperation came from grief and love for his daughter. We need to channel that energy, to shift the focus from fear and pain to something more peaceful. The plan was simple in theory, but carrying it out felt like a monumental task. Lila instructed them to gather personal items from Emma's room, as well as the letters and photographs from the previous family. Together, they created a small altar in the corner of the living room, where the energy seemed the least oppressive. John, Sarah, this will only work if you both fully commit to letting go of the fear, Lila said firmly. You need to focus on love, your love for Emma, your hope for this home. That's the kind of energy that can dispel something like this. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face as she held onto their daughter. John felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to focus. He knelt beside Sarah, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Max lay at their feet, his presence grounding them. As Lila began her work, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The air grew heavier, colder, as though the entity was resisting their efforts. Shadows flickered on the walls, and faint whispers seemed to echo from the corners of the room. John felt his resolve falter, but he tightened his grip on Sarah's hand, reminding himself why they were doing this. Lila's voice was steady as she spoke, a mix of words in English and another language John didn't recognize. She called out to the presence, addressing it directly. You are no longer bound to this place. Your pain, your anger, they don't belong here. Let go. The temperature in the room dropped further, and for a moment, John thought he saw a faint figure take shape near the altar. It was tall and indistinct, like a shadow come to life. His heart pounded as he fought the instinct to look away. Focus, Lila urged. Don't give it power by fearing it. Show it that it has no hold here. John swallowed hard and closed his eyes, forcing himself to think of Emma, her laughter, her curiosity, the way she lit up their lives. He thought of the future they wanted for her, a future free of fear. Slowly, the oppressive weight in the room began to lift. The shadows receded, and the whispers faded into silence. When John opened his eyes, the figure was gone. The room felt lighter, almost warm, as though the house itself was releasing a long-held breath. Lila lowered her hands, exhaustion evident on her face, but there was a small, triumphant smile on her lips. It's done, she said softly. The energy is still here. It always will be in some form, but the tether has been broken. It won't harm you anymore." John and Sarah exhaled in unison, the relief washing over them like a wave. Max let out a happy bark, wagging his tail as though sensing the change. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around sleepily and smiled. "What's everyone doing?" Sarah laughed through her tears, kissing Emma's forehead. "Nothing, sweetie. Just cleaning up." The days that followed were quiet and uneventful, a welcome change from the chaos they had endured. John and Sarah made a point to pack away the letters and photographs, keeping them in a safe place as a reminder of what they had overcome. Lila left them with advice on how to maintain the positive energy in their home. But even without her guidance, the house felt different, brighter, safer. As they settled back into their routines, John often found himself reflecting on the experience. It had been terrifying, but it had also reminded him of the strength of their family. They had faced something unimaginable and come out stronger for it. Their bond, their love, had been the key to overcoming the darkness. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Sarah turned to John with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. John nodded, smiling as he looked at Emma playing with Max on the floor. "Yeah," he said. "I think we finally have our home back." And for the first time in what felt like forever, they truly believed it.